So there are three types of variables when we think about the scope of our variables in Solidity. And what do I mean by variable scope? I mean what is the access level of our variables? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at each type of variable and then get a better understanding that way of how it's defined in terms of a scope. So the first type of variable is a state variable. Okay. So state variable are variables whose value are permanently stored in contract storage. Okay. So all that really means is that a state variable is a variable that we declare that goes in the contract storage specifically. So a state variable are the variables that we can access throughout our functions and our contract, and we declare these variables, and they're called state variables. So an example here is the stored data, right? Remember in our previous videos where we built our first smart contract, we made a store data variable and we set it to an integer, right? This is a state variable because we can then actually use this stored data in different functions, like our constructor, which is a special function, the constructor function, that we will learn about later on. But as we can see, we can actually access our state variable in our constructor function here by calling our stored data and setting it to a value of 10. Okay, so that is a state variable. Now, local variables are the variables that we access within a function. All right, so let's scroll down here. So let's go into this function. So in this function, we see store data. Is this a local variable? Well, no, right? This variable is actually a state variable. This variable is actually a state variable, which we declare in our contract, right? Now, if we were to declare another variable in this function, for example, if we were to say, multiplier, and we declare this as an integer, and we set it to, let's say, 5, and then in our stored data, we did x times multiplier. Effectively, we have created a new variable, but this variable, multiplier, or you know what, let's call it multiplier by 5 to be more specific, okay? But this variable essentially can only be accessed within this function, right? The rest of our contract is going to remain unaware of our local variable here as long as it remains in the scope of this, because it remains in the scope of this function. So whereas our stored data, the state variable, can be accessed throughout our entire contract, as we can see here, our multiplier by 5 can only be accessed within this function. Now, if that's a little bit confusing still, the key takeaway here is that this is very important when it comes to actually defining and writing out our code, so that we can, because otherwise multiplier by 5, if it were to be accessible everywhere, it could really mess up our code. The more coding you do, the more intuitive it becomes, let's say, because you're keeping track of your variables and how they're interacting. But when you're first starting out, I guess the takeaway here is that this variable, multiplier by 5, is only going to remain in this function, whereas our stored data is going to be accessible throughout our entire contract. And multiplier by 5 is therefore a local variable.